Hello, my name is David McFadden. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Museum of Arts and Design. I'm happy to welcome all of you to a very timely and exciting event that is the preface to the opening of a really splendid exhibition called Changing Hands 3. For those of you that don't know the background, the reason it's Changing Hands 3 is that over the past 10 years, the museum has, with our guest curator, Ellen Taubman, organized 3 major exhibitions surveying contemporary art among Native and Indigenous artists throughout the United States and Canada. The third and culminating installment brings together a great number of artists from Canada, more than we've had in past exhibitions, but artists whose work span a greater range of materials and processes than before, including video, and we have an incredible number of film and performance recordings, etc. It's a very exciting show that really positions contemporary Native art within the mainstream of contemporary art today and looking at all of its ramifications. The whole series, funnily enough, started at a conversation at dinner when I met Ellen Taubman for the first time. It was at someone's house. We happened to be seated next to each other, and I learned that Ellen had just come from her very distinguished career at Sotheby's, having founded the Native Art Department at Sotheby's. And I had just moved back to New York after having been the director of the Millicent Rogers Museum in Taos, New Mexico, which is where I got my first experience of what was happening within the Native artist community in terms of the excitement and the innovation that was occurring there. And out of a conversation, which was almost like, Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, let's put on a show. Changing Hands 1 was born, which looked at art in the southwestern region. Changing Hands 2 looked at the Pacific area, including the Pacific Rim, including Hawaii, Canada, Alaska, a great number of artists whose careers have been stellar. And now the third, which looks at work north and south of the northern part of the United States and southern Canada, but really everything east of the Mississippi in the United States, but into Inuit territory in Canada. We are here today to discuss some of the issues that have driven these exhibitions, which includes the revaluation of what Native art contributes to the larger international and global art scene today, and how these artists are really shaping the future. We're going to be looking at both past and present, and out of these discussions, get some inkling of what is coming down the line. It's an exciting time, and we're happy to be, as a museum, in the forefront of presenting this material. But now I would like to introduce Ellen Taubman, the guest curator. Ellen, if you could come out. Ellen has been a stalwart ally throughout this entire process, and Ellen, you deserve our applause for this particular installment. After the seminar is over, you of course are invited to go to the galleries and see the exciting exhibition. We also should welcome, on behalf of the museum, the great number of artists that came here today from all over Canada and the United States. We have an incredible complement of people here today, and we're very honored that you're with us. But now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Ellen Taubman, who will introduce our moderators today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have to say that it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be standing in front of you and to have had the opportunity to not only do this exhibition, but all 3 exhibitions, and be in such incredible company of all the wonderful artists who are here today, but all the wonderful artists who have contributed to this exhibition and the preceding 2 exhibitions. I also think today is special because it's the first time we've been able to have a collaboration with the National Museum of the American Indian, and I had the pleasure and privilege again of working with friend and colleague Kathleen Ash-Milby, and this afternoon would not be possible without her. So thank you, Kathleen, for working with me and for making this afternoon possible. This has been a great search and a great adventure, and I think there's a lot of important people here today who have a lot to say. So let me introduce the moderators, and they will do the real work here. So first I'll start with Kate Morris. Kate Morris received her PhD from Columbia University in 2001. She is co-editor with Veronica Pasalacqua of the forthcoming Native Art Now, a collection of essays by Native artists and Native and non-Native curators and scholars. Native Art Now reflects on the key developments in contemporary Native American art from 1992 to 2012. It is generously underwritten by the Eiteljorg Museum of American Indians and Western Art, and I'd like to acknowledge Jennifer Complo McNutt, who's sitting in the audience. Happy to see her here. As a scholar, Morris is interested primarily in contemporary Native American painting, installation, and performance, and she has published on these topics in National Museum of the American Indian Magazine and American Indian Art Quarterly. She's been a contributor to the exhibition catalog Shape-Shifting, Transformations in Native American Art, Peabody Essex Museum 2012, very recent, and Off the Map, Landscape and Native Imagination, National Museum of the American Indian 2007. Morris lives in San Francisco, California, and is Associate Professor of Art History at Santa Clara University. So welcome, Kate. Judith Rodenbach also earned her PhD at Columbia University. She's an art historian and critical theorist whose research concentrates on art practices since 1945. Editor-in-chief of the Art Journal from 2006 to 2009, Rodenbach's writing on art and criticism of the 20th and 21st centuries has appeared in both scholarly and popular publications. Her book, Radical Prototypes, Alan Caprow, An Invention of Happenings, was published by MIT Press in 2011. She has written extensively about the art of the 1960s, including most recently for the forthcoming Gutai exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in 2013 for Antonio Manuel, I Want to Act, Not Represent, and at the American Society 2011, as well as in magazines such as October, Artform, and Grey Room. So welcome, Judith. And this is going to be a very lively discussion, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm Kate Morris, and the first thing I want to do is tell you a little bit about the format for this afternoon, because we do have kind of a long time block, which is wonderful, 3:30 to 6 p.m. And so our idea is to speak in somewhat intimate conversations with the artists. We're going to begin with Robert Houle and George Longfish, who I will officially introduce in just a moment, and be in conversation with them for probably about 20 minutes. And then we will switch over and bring the other 4 artists on and be in conversation with them. And then there'll be a short break, about 15 minutes probably. And when we come back, we'll have a full hour, and that hour will be devoted to conversation with you. So at that time, all 6 artists will be on stage. And well, Judith and I will either be squeezed into the margins of the stage, or we'll be out there with microphones to make sure that the conversation is really a full room conversation. So that will be the final hour, and that will be after the break. So there really isn't room for audience questions in this very first part of the program, but if you'd like to write down your questions, there'll be more than time for that afterwards. So officially, I'd like to say that we are pleased and honored to begin this afternoon's program in conversation with 2 renowned artists, Robert Houle and George Longfish. In addition to their success as artists, both of these men have had distinguished careers as curators, writers, and educators. They have been instrumental in the development of native arts in Canada and the US for nearly 40 years. There are many parallels in their biographies, and I'll begin by highlighting a few of these before turning to the particulars. Robert Houle is of Anishinaabe, I knew I was going to have trouble with that, Anishinaabe descent, born in 1947 in the Sandy Bay First Nation in Manitoba, Canada. He started art and art history at the University of Manitoba in the 1970s before graduating with a degree in art education from McGill University in Montreal in 1975. In 1977, he was appointed curator of contemporary Aboriginal art at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and in 1992, he co-curated the landmark exhibition, Land, Spirit, Power, First Nations at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, as part of the Columbian Quincentennial. As a teacher, Houle has been a mentor and inspiration to 3 generations of artists in Canada. He is currently a professor of painting at Ontario College of Art and Design. George Longfish was born in 1942 on the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada. He was sent to New York State to attend Indian school and traveled from there to high school in Chicago. He earned his MFA in painting, sculpture, and printmaking at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1972. From 72 to 73, Longfish was the director of the University of Montana graduate program in American Indian art, the first such program to focus on Native American art in the United States. He left Montana to become a professor in the Department of Native American Studies at the University of California at Davis, and he retired from that position 30 years later in 2003. While at UC Davis, Longfish was director of the C.N. Gorman Museum, which featured the work of many established and emerging artists such as Kay Walkingstick, Edgar Heap of Birds, and Dwayne Slick. In 1992, Longfish also participated in one of Canada's landmark quincentennial exhibitions. His 25-foot-long triptych painting entitled End of the Innocents was actually still wet when installed at the Canadian Museum of Civilization as part of Indigena, Contemporary Native Perspectives in Canadian Art. The artistic resumes of Houle and Longfish are equally impressive. Houle has had more than 25 solo exhibitions worldwide. Examples of his work are in many private and public collections, including the National Gallery of Canada, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, Australia, the Eiteljorg Museum of American Indians and Western Art in Indianapolis, and the Heard Museum in Phoenix. Houle has been artist in residence at the Tamarind Institute in Albuquerque and has held a Canada Council International Residency in Paris, France, 2006. Houle was given the Canada Council grants 4 times and was awarded an Eiteljorg Fellowship for Native American Fine Art in 2003. Longfish and his work have been featured in numerous solo and group exhibitions. In addition to Indigena, these include the Decade Show at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York in 1990, and Continuum at the National Museum of the American Indian in 2004. In 2007, Longfish was accorded a major retrospective exhibition, imaginatively titled George Longfish, a Retrospective, organized by the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. Most recently, Longfish was featured in Manifestations, New Native Art Criticism, published by the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe in 2011. So please join me in welcoming George Longfish and Robert Houle. I'd like to begin today by reading a quote by Robert Houle, something he wrote in 1992 when he was co-organizer of Land Spirit Power, which many of you are aware of as one of the first major exhibitions in Canada, well, in North America, to showcase postmodern Native American art. And I think it's important to begin with a question that frames postmodernism. And so what I will do is read this quote and then ask Judith for some kind of reflections on what postmodernism might mean today, and then turn this over to Robert and George. So not letting Robert speak for himself, but rather reading his own words for him. Because he might want to distance himself. You never know. Remember, these were written in 1992, some 30 years ago. Quote, "Postmodernism is not the significant intellectual and cultural shift it has been touted as. The center of power has not moved. The First Nations of the world are still not even in the picture." Unquote. That's for you, Judith.
You'll take it.
You're going to stand behind it? Okay, but Judith is going to redefine postmodernism for us first.
Okay. So what strikes me in encountering that quote, which is now 30.
20.
20. No, hey.
This is why I'm an
art history,
historian.
not math. Yeah. Is that we're now in a moment where we are looking back on postmodernism and understanding it less as a moment of thorough paradigm shift, but rather as a moment of turbulence. One of the things that it strikes me that's happened in the contemporary art world, in this revisioning of the postmodern, as it were, is a revisioning through the imperatives of globalization, however we want to take that term, through questions of transnationalism, which means crossing borders, but also rethinking borders, rethinking territoriality, rethinking linguistic imperatives, conceptual imperatives, imperatives of identity, and how we form identity. So I want to just sort of throw that out there as a way of marking, in a sense, the prescience of that remark, the accuracy of its diagnostic in the first instance, but now rehearing it, the way in which it asks us to understand where we are at the current moment. So I thought I would start, George, by asking you, since you were in the Decade Show, I know. Very clever, right? If
Okay.
I was sweating for nothing.
you were getting all nervous. I wonder if you would possibly share with us some reflections since the Decade Show about that appearance in the Decade Show at the New Museum and what you see as shifts, perhaps in the kind of art context in which you are present, plural contexts.
I think in one way I got lucky enough to be accepted. We had gone through a process as Native artists, which was really kind of interesting. First it was ethnic art, then it was minority art, then it was artists of color, and then it was multicultural artists. So you had a choice. Not always a good one, but you had a choice. So in one way, it was interesting to be accepted into that show, and it wasn't a big work. It was a small piece. And I always, to this day, wonder how the hell it got in. But at that time, there was a huge change happening, and that's when. Let me think for a minute now. James Luna did his artifact piece, which was incredible. I mean, he participated in it, and he became a living artifact. That was a great change. It was a change also because prior to the postmodernism and everything there was a space for Native American artists to kind of make that transition into the art world. There were a number of them ready to do it, but postmodernism came along, and then that disappeared. And in that process, it's I think, from my perspective, we've always had to really work the concept of what it meant to be identified as a Native artist or as a certain tribe. And that's pretty difficult in a way because, I mean, anthropologists used to ask me, you should know about your culture. Okay, got that. You should know about your specific designs for the Iroquois as opposed to the specific designs for the Plains, and that's a big jump. So in a way, you're trying to be, quote, and one of the biggest concepts we had at that time was, what are we? Are we artists or are we Native? And it became a big problem for us. It was a time also when the national federal law went into effect about the arts and crafts law. In order to be able to sell anything, you had to prove that you carried a card. You were a legitimate, authentic Indian. Otherwise, you couldn't go into shows. It was interesting. And I think that had to do a lot with Indian shows in a way, because there were a number of people that were saying that they were of Indian heritage but didn't have cards, and go into these shows and win tremendous prizes. But in the actuality, they weren't Indian. So the law was made to kind of protect. I always have a problem with a law that tries to protect you. It never works. BIA yeah, was created in Grant's term, and it's been a maze. I've done the paintings on it. it's amazed in a way because it's hard to get into the BIA to get and move you into the direction that you want to move in order for whatever you're concerned about in your land right or whatever. And those that work in it have a big problem trying to make their way out of the Bureau itself. So it's like, it's a problem. It was interesting because in the Decade Show, yes, I got in. But I think I got in because it was really, the Decade Show was the first major show that acknowledged ethnic people, regardless of being Native American, and acknowledged blacks and acknowledged the Mexicans. So it was an opener, and I think that out of that came a book by Lucy Lepard, which then opened another door. And she, in her whole sense, said, "I'm not going to defend it or justify it or whatever. I'm just going to allow you. The door's open. Take a look." For myself, it was interesting because prior to the Decade Show, I did my work. It was abstract. I would take it to a gallery that had modern art in it. I would show it to them. They'd look at it and say, "Nice. You ought to go to an Indian gallery." I said, "Okay." I went to the Indian gallery, and the Indian gallery looked at it and said, "Nice. You ought to go to the modern gallery." I said, So I just kept painting. I've been at it now over 40 years, and I have come to the resolution, I don't care. I'm doing what I like to do. Yes, I still do issues, and they're big. I have within that the definition of started out with the angry young man, angry young Indian. Now I'm the angry old Indian. I think it was a door opening. I'm not sure if it was really beneficial. We're still fighting some issues, but it hasn't stopped. It's gone into another phase, and I think the phase is really important in the essence because there's some incredible changes happening. And you're either going to be right with it, or you're going to be screaming and yelling. And that's your choice. I think no one knows where I am right now, which is kind of good because I'm in the outback. I live in Maine. And what's really interesting is that, and I look out, I see my good friend there, Peter. When we started out in the 60s, we were fighting, trying to get ourselves acknowledged and recognized. Here I am in Maine, fighting for and then getting acknowledged for the Native American in Maine and in that northeastern woodland area. They look at my art and like, what's Indian art? And it's rather interesting that their perceptions today is they look at my art and it's basically political. Okay, got it. So I'm starting over again. I hope I'm not on the same treadmill. Thank you.
So, Robert, maybe I can ask a sort of reframing question, because I think it would still be interesting to hear whether you think after 20 years that Indians are actually in the picture or not, but also because of what George said, that basically his work is political, even that abstraction can carry politics. And this is another place where I think that your work and George's resonates, because you both have developed abstraction and a kind of symbolic language in abstraction. But also whether you think in a way that postmodernism equals political, or did it, and is it different now?
I think first, when we want to deal with the polemics that come out of postmodernity, I think we have to understand the framework that modernity did to placing our art. I don't think we are ever given credit culturally, spiritually, what we gave to modernity, especially American modernity, when Europeans came here, artists, after the war, after the last Great War. I know that great artists like Barnett Newman have to be careful with what I say, I guess. I'm a great admirer of Newman, and I think he fully understood, for example, being an abstract painter, the abstraction that he found that was there in Northwest Coast, patterns, the walls where, let's say, a hummingbird could be dissected and it's put into some kind of a flat form, and even in the totem poles and in the masks. He understood, and in the chili cat blankets. When he first put that exhibition together at Betty Parson Gallery here in New York, I think it was around 1942, 47, I'm not sure. My brain cells are going. And it's very interesting. Not much really has changed, is basically what I'm saying. I think as artists, as contemporary North American indigenous artists, I think postmodernity and its polemics are okay. Not for us though, because that language is made or is crafted for the larger society to interrogate some of the things, the patriarchy that we find in modernity. And it's Judeo-Christian based, and these are patriarchal religions, and then of course that ideology comes in the process. I was telling George Margaret. I was just talking about earlier in 1985, I think. I was in a panel at. I was a moderator for a panel at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, on. It was a 40-year anniversary of the Canada Council, and I was asked to chair a conference, a section of the conference called Other Voices, and it was primarily about feminist writing. And I spent a good 2 years reading about feminist theories and the chalice and something. I don't know what it was called, but in the end, at the end of the day, I would hate. No, first of all, I got the sense, and I'm talking about patriarchy. I would walk, because of what I had read, I would walk into the street, and I could feel what women would feel, that they're just objects on the street, and it was really quite frightening and uncomfortable and totally vulnerable, to point that I would actually hate myself for being a male because of what women go through on a daily basis. Now, having said that, this is, for me, I understand now what I mean by the Judeo-Christian patriarchy that is ideologically present in modernity. So now we go to post-modernity. Well, that deconstruction of all of that for this previous ideology, it's made for the larger society. For us, we're just bystanders to this discourse. Not much really has changed. Certain things there been some incremental changes. We now have our own curators. We are slowly having our own scholars, and they're present here. And but we're still left in the on the sidelines. Recent scholar conference in some city in Ottawa. I wasn't going to say Ottawa, but no, it just came out. Damn it! We have a reactionary president, prime minister. All the participants, Aboriginal speakers, scholars, curators, did their presentation at dinner at the end of the day, when everybody else did their papers during the day. That's what I mean. Things really have not changed. And I'll give you another example, a far more practical example. I've been teaching at the Ontario College of Art first for 15 years, and then I took 2 years off, and I'm back again. Altogether, probably about 20 years, 18 years. I loved it there, but it's still very, very Eurocentric. Although I had gone to an Eurocentric university like McGill, where we weren't even allowed to study Canadian art when I was studying art history at McGill. And now I teach Indigenous abstraction, level 3. What I do is I take a traditional example, and up to this point in my career, after being I sold my first painting in 1972 to the National Museum when I was still a student at McGill for $90. I got hooked. So, what happened was I would ask. I use a story of how young women are taught to develop their patterns in beadwork. They go out into the woods, take a leaf, fold it, imagine a pattern, and fold it and bite it. They precede birch bark biting. So they would take these leaves, bite them with a specific pattern in mind, and then unravel it, and that's how I teach Indigenous. One of my exercises for Indigenous abstraction, and also the notion of making abstraction using your body, because you're using your teeth, your mouth to create a pattern, and I still find a lot of resistance towards something like that, and we're not today, even today, after all this time, after all of supposedly this advancement, we're not recognized, and for the longest time, and this is what I wanted to say, and I'll close with that. I firmly believed when I was a student at University of Manitoba, at McGill, and when I studied drawing and painting in Salzburg, Austria, I never believed that we had any culture of art in the making. But as a speaker, I began, in the last little while, I talked to myself in my language. And then I speak to myself. And then this is when I began to realize that there is a word. We had been hoodwinked to think that we had no word for art. We do. It's called mazinichigan. Anything that is made either by drawing, by painting. You see that on the Laurentian seal. You see that in the Grand Canyon. You know, these are all images that have been made. And we have a word for that in Anishinaabe, in my language, masnichigan, masnibiga, you know, and so we do have a word for art. But you know what? I had to personally decolonize myself in my own studio, the most private space ever for an artist. Thank you.
So I have some more bios to read, and I don't want to take too much time with them away from the conversation, but I think it's really important to recognize the incredible breadth and depth and prowess of the people that we have up here. So I'm going to regale you with some dates and names of collections and things. I should probably go in order here so that you can stay visually oriented. So I will start with Sarah Sense on my right. Sarah Sense received her BFA in 2003 from Cal State University at Chico and an MFA in 2005 at Parsons, the New School for Design here in New York. In 2010 alone, Sense had exhibitions at the National Museum of the American Indian, HYDE, curated by Kathleen Ash Milby, Evergreen State College in Olympia, which is called Pieces of Home, Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, and Chelsea Art Museum in New York City. Since 2010, Sense has been traveling and researching contemporary indigenous arts throughout North, South, and Central America. This project yielded her first book, Weaving the Americas, A Search for Native Art in the Western Hemisphere, and a solo exhibition by the same title that premiered in Valdivia, Chile in 2011. Her work can be found in numerous public collections, including the National Museum of the American Indian and the Tweed Museum of Art at the University of Minnesota. To her right, Jeffrey Gibson received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Art Institute in Chicago and his Master's of Arts from the Royal College of Art in London in 1998. In addition to being named a TED Foundation Fellow in 2012, Gibson has received a Percent for Art Commission by the Department of Cultural Affairs in New York City in 2010, an Eiteljorg Museum Fellowship in Contemporary Art 2009, and a Visual Arts grant from Creative Capital Foundation in 2005. His work has been featured and reviewed in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Village Voice, Boston Globe, Art in America, Art News, Art Lies, and the Brooklyn Rail. Gibson's extensive exhibition resume includes shows at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the National Museum of the American Indian, Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art, Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, and Participant Incorporated here in New York. His work will be featured in upcoming exhibitions at the National Academy Museum in New York, the National Gallery of Canada, and Horton Gallery in Berlin. Kent Monkman began his career as a painter and illustrator, having studied at Sheridan College of Applied Arts in Brampton, Ontario. Monkman's work has been featured in numerous solo and group exhibitions throughout Canada, New York, London, and other international venues. Among these are the 17th Biennale of Sydney, Australia in 2010, the Art Game at Art Toronto in 2011, and Shapeshifting, Transformations in Native American Art at the Peabody Essex Museum in 2012. His performances as the fabulous Miss Chief Cher Eagle Testicle includes the recent NMAI Washington engagement of Miss Chief Justice for the Peace, and that is of course spelled P-I-E-C-E. Among Kent's numerous film and video credits are Shooting Geronimo 2006 and Dance to the Berdache 2008. Skawanati is an artist and independent curator who earned her BFA from Concordia University, Montreal in 1992. While a board member at Artist Run Oboro in Montreal in 1994, she co-founded Nation to Nation, a First Nations artist collective with fellow artist Ryan Rice, who's here, and Eric Roberto. In 1996, Skawanati established the innovative and influential online art space Cyber Powwow. Her own new media artwork addressing history, the future, and change includes Imagining Indians in the 25th Century, a web-based paper doll journal, Thanksgiving Address, Greetings to the Technological World, a flash movie, and 80 Minutes, 80 Movies, 80s Music, an ongoing series of music videos. Skawanati's Time Traveler is a multi-platform project that includes a website which won the Imaginative's Best New Media Award in 2009. Skawanati was an Eiteljorg Contemporary Art Fellow in 2011. So please let me welcome all four of you today.
So I want to start with this notion of time travel a little bit, and I'm going to twist it probably in an awkward way, but we'll try. Thinking about, you're all working in the contemporary context, and that context is one in which in the international, let's say, biennial festival circuit, in large measure, concept for the last decade or so has been elevated over craft to the degree that a term like de-skilling, that is making kind of de-skilled artwork, has become a term of valuation. At the very same time that this year's Whitney Biennial twists that again and is packed, or was packed, with projects in which craft came to the fore. And I want to just note as an aside the presence of a painting by Leonard Peltier in that biennial, embedded in someone else's project as a kind of viral presence. So I wanted to ask the four of you to think a little bit about remediation. You're all working in ways that are technically very savvy and complex, ways that also deal with mining histories and recrafting ways of looking at those histories. So at lunch, for instance, we were talking about, can I talk about the Columbus for a nanosecond? So we were talking about a proposal to bead the, the column, the Columbus column, outside, which does some very interesting things, both with craft, technique, technology, medium, and history. Right? So maybe, do you mind talking about that piece a little bit, or that proposal? Maybe not that piece, but where you were going with that. And then I'd ask you each to think about sort of history and your practice in the way that it articulates that. I think those are on anyway. Yeah.
Actually, they would like us to use them because of the recording.
Sorry, you get one.
Okay, is that okay? Yeah, I think that piece actually started when Ellen and I started talking about this exhibition, and it was just such a, present monument, and then of course Columbus, and Manhattan for beads, and just thinking about the materials, and then thinking what happens when you decontextualize beadwork outside of a native context. It goes into Mardi Gras, it goes into drag, it goes into camp, it gets kitsch, and so it kind of just played with so many histories, not just native histories, by thinking about what placing beads on that monument in such a spectacular scale would do. It's humorous, it was certainly not meant in any way to mock anything. I think it's just an interesting thing that I think to think about concept and materials and craft and technique. I think when you look at native traditions, oftentimes the material for me is the concept. Somehow they're kind of inextricably linked in a way that, if I cover something with hide, it immediately transforms it into an entirely new context. Or if you cover something in beads, the same object suddenly becomes, its purpose shifts, its physical feature shift, and its cultural context shifts and asks questions. So I think in looking at traditional techniques and processes, I just keep getting kind of hit with this wave of that. I actually don't have to think about a concept. I just have to fall in love with the material, and somehow the material inherently has concept attached to it and within it and within the process. And also, a lot of these techniques are laborious, so the actual time spent is this kind of union with the object, but it's also, it gives you a real physical engagement that's extended over time, that transforms the material, transforms the object, and eventually becomes an artwork.
Well, and I'll ask a follow-up question for Oscar and Nadia about this idea of the use of material, because I know that you're an advocate for thinking of cyberspace not necessarily just as an abstract concept or even as an abstract place, but actually as a medium. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and the idea that even practices that are web-based can be considered craft.
Thank you. Yes, I really do consider it craft. I was having dinner with a professor from design art at Concordia University the other day, and I was telling her about this new project that I want to do that involves sewing. I've also been a sewist all my life, but she didn't know that. And I said, I told her, yeah, I think I'm gonna like do some sewing, and she's like, oh, but you know, what about the embodiment of that? And how are you gonna, you'll prick your finger on the needle and you'll touch the material? And I said, babe, my wrist is killing me, you know, and I mean, my practice is embodied just by, you know, sitting in front of the computer. I think it's still, I think people, there's, you know, I think there's not quite the disconnect that people maybe believe between, you know, you and the work when you're at a computer. I think that there are, just like if you're talking about fabric or if you're talking about hide or beads, there are constraints to the material. There are things it lets you do. There are things that it tells you to do. There are feelings and ideas it evokes that other materials might not. Some, you know, I feel a little bit like I'm repeating myself because some people have heard this already, but you know, I chose to use you know, an online virtual world for the Time Traveler TM series because I felt it evoked the idea of the future, and I wanted people to be seeing something that seemed very futuristic and in another time. And so, so there's that. And then, of course, it's also very laborious. And that's another thing I think that people maybe don't think. They think you press a button and there it is, you know. But actually, it's a building, and it's even. Oh, Bonnie Devine, are you here? Because, well, I had such a nice conversation with you back in November when you told me that I was doing sculpture, which I didn't think my own self. But as you know, you put that little seed in my mind, and as I've been editing the movies since then, I think of it as carving now, you know, and you're shaving away and kind of revealing the true essence of what but in this case of what the story is. So that's my little blurb on that.
Sarah, I wanted to kind of, now I'm going to pick on you a little bit. Since you're working with, as I take it, quasi-traditional technique or some version of that technique, weaving these photographic materials together, can you talk a little bit about that in terms of process, not just the weaving itself, but the photographic element? There's something very interesting that's taking place in all of your work, actually, that has to do with a relationship to what we might call the documentary and the sort of tweaking of the documentary.
Sure. Well, I guess to start with, the weaving that I incorporate with my photographs is chiramacha basket technique from my mother's ancestry. Excuse me, my mother's father's ancestry. And there are only about 3 weavers that are weaving now. So when I took on kind of a challenge to do the weaving, it was something that I felt kind of called to do. I was not trained how to do it traditionally using the river cane, which we grow there on the reservation near the bayou, and then you have to, you know, there's a whole process that goes with the tradition. When I was, I did go to the chairman to ask for permission to do the work using non-traditional material, and received a lot of support to go forward with that. And I later then, shortly after that, conceived of the idea of using photography, my photography, images of the landscape. So that, I guess, was the first time that I was really kind of exploring with the documentation of what the contemporary society was for the Chitimacha Reservation at that time, while I was there doing youth programming. So I felt very, for the first time in my life, immersed in this community that my family had been estranged from for so many years. And for me, the weaving was really important to kind of reconnect to something that I had been so far away from for the first 19 years of my life. So what happened was actually not just a documentation and using photographs that I had taken, but also there was a reconnection where it's just some different experiences that I would have by sitting on the bayou, for example, kind of meditating. So there was a spiritual reconnection for me, which again, like you were talking about before, where is this may sound a little bit off base, but I think a lot of times in contemporary Native art, there are some other things that aren't discussed in the larger art world, and sometimes that, I don't want to shoot myself in the foot, but sometimes it can be a spiritual thing, and it's not always written about. And for me, I think that there were these two things that were happening. Later, I then was sort of dissecting Hollywood imagery and working with the Indian princess and the cowgirl personas, which was more fun. And then later, what I'm doing now is a documentation of the Americas. So in the last year, I've traveled through 12 countries and photographing the landscapes and photographing the sea and the mountains, and not the communities per se, but there's certain like magical moments where people ended up in my photo. Like the piece that is here in the Changing Hands exhibition, it's of a boy, and it's actually a photograph that I was taking in Atitlan in Guatemala, and the boy rode his bike right into my frame. And for me, that just has to do with community, and that's what this trip really was about. Sorry, I'll back up a little bit by saying when I was traveling, I was going from one Native community to another. So I was traveling on bus from Guatemala City to Santiago over the course of 100 days, going from one Native community to another, meeting with artists, talking to people, doing interviews, and just basically kind of connecting to other Indigenous artists and learning about what they were doing. So the documentation at that time became about these other artists that I was sort of communing with, but also documentation of land. So it had kind of twofold, about land and community. And then again, going back to what I do with my photographs, which is weaving them using the Chitimacha basket patterns. Did that answer your question? Kind of? Okay.
Well, I have one for Kent, of course, because we can't leave him quiet there too
No.
long. Well, as Jeffrey and Skawinati and Sarah have been talking, what sort of strikes me is that we're talking about Native media and some Native techniques, but also we're talking about Native aesthetics. I was thinking about your painting, Kent, of Artist and Hunter, in which you paint Miss Chief, who is also producing a painting within the painting, right? And Artist and Model, that's right. I'm combining yours with Hunter in The Time Traveler. That's what I've done there. But which would be kind of great. Mischief in cyberspace. Yeah. So for those of you who haven't seen this painting, it's a beautifully rendered sort of 19th century style painting, but Miss Chief is doing a painting in the painting, and if you look at her canvas, what you see is birch bark with some sort of mnemonic figures. And I'm kind of curious how you're feeling about the concept of Native aesthetics, and especially in reference to performance practice, and whether Native aesthetics really inform performance in addition to your painting.
Definitely. Well, first of all, most of my work as a painter has been about exploring this canon of art history, a European tradition. So my work is traditionally based, but it really is about exploring the art history painted and written by Europeans and with Native people, Aboriginal people as subjects. So my work really began as an exploration of painters in the 19th century like George Catlin and Albert Bierstadt, and painters whose gaze was upon the indigenous people of North America. And I felt that, essentially our histories were absent from this canon of art history, the art history that we've all been taught. It's the same history that, had painted out Aboriginal narratives. So I began a process to engage with these paintings, to challenge the subjectivity of their work, to challenge these missing narratives, to locate narratives that are informed by an indigenous point of view, an indigenous way of thinking about the landscape, an indigenous way of thinking about storytelling, and so forth. But the only way that I could really do that, and to do it in a way that would also respect the history of, these painters who were masters at what they did, was to actually engage on a long course of actually teaching myself how to paint as well as they did. And that's been my course, is to work with a tradition of painting that is very long. And for me, it's also a way of kind of connecting an indigenous history, a through line that ran a parallel course that was interrupted by these histories, by these art histories, through the course of modernity, and through the breaking down of that vocabulary of painterly language. So for me, that it's been very important to sort of follow that through line, to see how that course of art history also had an impact on our own histories. And in terms of Aboriginal aesthetic in performance culture, my alter ego grew out of these paintings. She appeared first in the paintings, and I found a moment to sort of bring her to life as a living character. And so most of my performance works are, again, very much about challenging this overarching art history that we have been sort of colonized by, and to locate, to create, to redirect the gaze, to reverse the gaze. And the artist and model is that one painting that really reverses that gaze by making the European the subject. The European becomes Miss Chief's object, and she becomes objectified, or sorry, the European male becomes objectified. In that case, it's sort of the Saint Sebastian. So for my work, it's very much about a kind of, reversing the gaze. As much as the European was looking at us, we were also looking back at them. And so I think that's been a large part of my performance work. And a lot of my performance work happens in museum spaces, because the museum, of course, is also a very problematic kind of institution in terms of how Aboriginal people, Indigenous people have been represented. And I've been very interested in that, and to ask questions about why, for instance, I was censored from, I wasn't allowed to show my work in the First Peoples Gallery at the Royal Ontario Museum during a group exhibition there. So I created a performance piece that challenged the fact that as a First Nations person, I could not show my work because the artist whose work was prominent in that gallery was a European painter from the 19th century, and the curator of that gallery said that my work would call into question the work of that artist.
That being the point.
So, and with Miss Chief Justice of the Peace, it was that was a piece that I did at National Museum of the American Indian, and that was about challenging ideas of how Native people are identified by the Canadian and by the U.S. government in terms of having to prove your blood quantum to get that certificate to exhibit your work as a Native person. And for me, that's very much about those laws, Canadian and American, are very much about designed to shrink our nations as opposed to growing our nations. So that piece was. It was an immigration hearing, and Miss Chief was taking applications to begin and grow her own nation.
My turn? I can follow up.
You can all join today.
I'll join. I can follow up really quickly, just because I was thinking about you know, the use of avatars or alter egos as these strategic interventions. And certainly, Skawanati, you've had all the room in the world to work with that in cyberspace. But I'm curious what you would think sort of about this freedom of making an entirely new self. And I also want to know if Jeffrey has an alter ego.
If I have an alter
Yeah?
ego?
Do you think he should? I think he should.
Everyone's getting one.
I know.
Sure. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. You know, on the one hand, I don't know if I should start by infinite freedom, because that's not true either. But I guess I've had a number of avatars since being able to have avatars, has happened, and they've had, we've had fun with them. Like, for example, in Cyber Powwow, we created avatars so that visitors to Cyber Powwow could come and be an Indian if they wanted to be, so they could wear Indian avatars. Now in Second Life, creating Hunter was really fun for me because it's my male piece. I get to be a guy, right? I get to move through that world as a male, and it's so interesting. I recently bought a penis for him. Yeah.
What did that cost you?
It was free. It was free. It was quite amazing. But I've had some. I had such an interesting story. It's kind of long, so I'm going to just try and shorten it to be more to that point. But our sets in our virtual space, which is called an island, Abtech Island, if you ever want to come visit, was overtaken by some very some hackers, some very clever hackers, and they were basically eating up our memory, which is I'm trying to anyway. Let's just say they were using up our space, okay? And we couldn't figure out why, and then we found these avatars, a whole bunch of avatars, we're basically squatting in our space, and so it was like I couldn't have asked for a better movie situation in a certain way, because these 5 avatars were sitting in this space that was kind of hidden away on our set, and which is me and my team of wonderful chicks who helped me make the movies, we were in a computer room. So we all got online, and there was like us against them. And they were on first, because I was actually kind of teaching this class. And so this thing is happening, and B calls me over and says, like, look we found these people. These are the ones who are eating up all our memory. So I come in as Hunter. And I'm a very big avatar too in Hunter, okay? I'm not just a male. I'm like a 9-foot tall, bulky guy with a dreadhawk, And these people are saying they're having this little fight. They're all bickering, and I stand there and they're like, "Who are you?" And I said, "I am the land," because I was the owner of that land, and that virtual land. And it was just a very interesting feeling for me to have the power of being the owner, the power of the male body, and the power of, I guess you could say, knowledge of those, of that, my relationship to that place. So it's been very interesting, and yeah, the next project I want to do is I guess I want to become my avatar, not Hunter, but my real Second Life avatar. And I think for myself, it's the next. We've talked a little bit at lunchtime about where we want to go, Native artists, and how we connect to the larger world, and one of the things I'm very interested in is clones. I mean, the problem or the issue of, like, if we're going to start having clones, but it's like avatars are a kind of clone in a certain way. There are these other selves, and why do we want them, and why do we need them? And so I think that's a much larger issue that, that's not just about a native issue, but that can start from this place where I am, and based in the place that I am and who I am as a Native artist. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I was able to think about that question. I don't think I have an alter ego.
Sarah,
Yeah.
do you want to weigh in before Judith takes off on that? You're in all of your works, but as yourself?
Yeah, well, the Indian Princess and Cowgirls series, which was, I don't know, I guess I was doing that for like 4 or 5 years. So my sort of my ancestry is my mother's side is Native, Chitimacha and Choctaw, and my father's side is a mix of European. My father is German, and my grandmother doesn't have an answer really. She just says she's a Texan or she's a cowgirl. And so this, like, of course, for me was sort of comical. And looking at my grandmothers, I sort of saw one as like the Indian princess and one as the cowgirl. And so that's where I sort of took on these personas. And then what I did with them was had photographs of me taken, or I photographed myself, and then wove those images into older Hollywood posters, like old Western movies, where I would actually go poster shopping when I lived in LA, in Hollywood or in Burbank, and cut apart the posters and recreate the narrative. So sometimes it had to do with kind of retelling a story where the Indian would win, or sometimes it had to do more with women's issues. So like the cowgirl, for example, is in Gone with the Wind, and sort of like she takes over Rhett rather than having Rhett in that, you know, the iconic image where he's on top of her. It gets switched. So for me, I think my two personas were more, they were about like reclaiming power, deconstructing narratives and retelling stories.
It's my position here is as the person who is completely external to this field. And what's interesting to me from that external position is to hear certain kinds of resonances that have to do with questions, very contemporary questions of narrativity, but also what I call metafictional or docufictional strategies. So I think of projects like the Fondation Arabe pour l'Image, which is the project that Walid Rad is affiliated with in the Middle East, which is a project that gathered it's still gathering documentary materials, these old collections of photographs from portrait studios or what have you, from the teens and 20s. And these artists have been engaged in redisplaying those, both in straight ways, that is, here's a collection made by so-and-so, but also in what I would call resorts, right? So curating the types of images that are shown to produce a different sense of the history of the Levant, right? A very particular kind of history. Or the Vietnamese-American photographer Anh My Le, who's been engaged in these photographic projects, looking at, most recently, military training grounds in places like, I guess it's outside Palm Springs in California, where the U.S. military is trained to go into battle in the Middle East, and taking photographs that look documentary, like you're someplace in wherever, generic Iraq, but actually you're in California. And she wound up finding reenactors in, I think, Northern Virginia, who were reenacting certain battles of the Vietnam conflict, and taking photographs of those reenactors, and they got very interested in her, and wound up casting her as the Viet Cong maiden, right? In these reenactments. So then she photographed herself as, but there's something very interesting that's happening in contemporary practice that takes up these documentary questions and kind of tweaks that sense of the document as something straight. I would say queers that sense of the document as a way of recapturing other histories, right? Other perspectives. And that's a way that I see a lot of the work that is upstairs, but in particular the work that you four are generating, as in operation, or at least resonating with contemporary projects.
Fair. Which I think links also to another theme that runs throughout many of your works. And George and Robert, maybe we should be getting to break soon so we can be in a full conversation, but is also sort of about, there's the rewriting of history so that the story can be told from a different perspective, and as George has said, revealing the lies of American history, et cetera. But there's also this other project that is about creating different and alternative worlds. And Jeffrey, for a while, your paintings were very much about a kind of utopia that wasn't necessarily even inhabited. So it wasn't specifically about national histories or conflicts. It was about the idea of creating something that could be alternative to our reality. But you sort of left that behind at some point. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about moving away from, well, creating a world and then leaving it in that sense.
Yeah, I think, you know, for people who have known my work for a while, they've thought that there's been many bodies of work which have, you know, kind of almost like chapters. But the way that I've always looked at it was sort of, I think, kind of decolonizing sort of what Robert was talking about, was each one of those bodies of work was really to process ideas and things to get to the next body of work that I didn't know how to make before I made that body of work. The particular series of paintings that you're talking about were an unpopulated, very lush, exotic landscape. And the reason why it was important to make those for me was because I feel like as Native people, I remember learning about the land from a very traumatic perspective. You know, the history that we inherit about the land that we're told about is oftentimes linked with social and political strife. So I really wanted to know what it felt like to objectify a beautiful landscape. And I think that that's something that a lot of Native people don't feel entitled to, because it's difficult for us to isolate the landscape from the history. So those series of paintings were very much about just wanting to know what it felt like to be intoxicated by beauty of landscape. And once I had that feeling, I was able to move on to the next body of work. So there was no need to continue envisioning that world.
But does that mean that your work now is sort of, can I say, post-traumatic? In other words, like that you don't have to engage with the trauma?
Yeah, I think there are people who have said that to me. I think I'm a relatively happy person, kind of almost against my better judgment sometimes. I think I'm overly optimistic. And I think that it is difficult in the art world, Native art world, in either way, but for beauty to become a significant element of critical thought. And for me, that is, that's probably become increasingly more the challenge and the focus of what I try to make, because I think it's a huge loss for people not to be able to experience it. And it's not to disregard history or trauma in any way. It's just to give yourself that opportunity to experience something powerful and beautiful and invested.
So we don't really have a script for this, as we were, wanting to leave it open so that this could really be an open-ended conversation with everyone involved. And this is also a time, certainly, for the artists to talk to each other about anything, any burning issues. So is there anyone who wants to start us off with a reflection or question?
I was wondering, in terms of cyberspace and hacking and the art world and terminology, when the artist is mimicked or copied, some have said that it's a sign of flattery. And I was wondering, in terms of people coming into your space and taking that space, did you ever have a moment of, I guess, honor, in a way, that the people would take the time to be in that space?
No.
Okay.
I was using some shorthand. No, these people, I don't think they cared at all that we were native or that we were artists. What they cared about was that we were not always on the island. This was a time of low production, and they saw that they were just there to take advantage. No, not yet.
So this ties into that as well in terms of the rest of the artists that are up there. For instance, with Miss Chief, and visiting the different worlds and working with materials and revisiting post-modernity or that label and whatnot. Have you ever had a moment of empowerment, either as the cowboy or the Indian? Did one weigh over another? In revisiting these different worlds, because I feel like you all talked a lot about defining a new world or being in a new world with your work. I was just wondering if you had those moments of empowerment, female, male, material, label, whatnot.
Nobody else wants to? No. Yes. No. Well, you talked about, taking on kind of like a male role and of course female role over here and stuff. And I guess I sort of felt empowered in both roles, as the Indian princess or as the cowgirl. But when I was, I noticed that the cowgirl actually did have a lot of masculine characteristics as well. And I started weaving the cowgirl into cowboys. It's so that they were sort of becoming one. And I didn't really recognize that. Somebody came into my studio and kind of like looked at it, was like walking around and looking at the cowgirl. And he was like, it's like you're trying to be a man. And, it's really about you, like, being kind of taking on these other roles, like other power roles and stuff. And not to say that that a female or a male is more powerful, but that there is kind of, what was the word that you were using? Empowerment? Being, like, I think with the personas, like a lot of the empowerment came from being able to kind of like switch a little bit. Does that make sense? Like between the Indian or the cowgirl or male or female.
Is there less of a separation between craft and fine art in the world of indigenous art than there is in the art world in general?
Yes.
That's what I think.
I think I would, I think that there's the modern traditional Native American artwork still very much hinges on the ability and the craft, in terms of recognizing kind of the expertise of the artist. And so I think that history will always have, and I think rightfully so, have a huge impact on how we look at either the embracing of craft or the rejection of craft. I don't know. I think that's just our history that we've inherited. And if you're going to talk about it in those contexts, I think you would have to address craft as a huge part of that history. Yeah, but I also think, just in the mainstream contemporary art world, craft and technique have become, whether it's a trend or it's a long-term, statement. I think, the art world kind of got flattened over the last 10 years. I think because of the grad programs, because of we're all reading the same books, we're all looking at the same galleries. You can see the same artwork in China as you can in New York. So I think that has something to do, maybe it's a result of a backlash of that, wanting to embrace craft and wanting to feel empowered in our craft as artists. I think that's where, for myself, I kind of wanted to remove the irony from my artwork and work more with my hands and extend the time that I'm making something. So
I think when you deal with the traditional crafts, you are in proximity with materials, and now with modern art practice, when we talk about process, we use words like materiality. And I never thought that I would actually engage non-Aboriginal students at the college, at the university where I teach abstraction, as the non-Aboriginal students, the non-native students, and the moment at the boys and the girls when they start folding the leaves, and that's just going as far as you can in our traditional, in the materials. I noticed that when students start using materials that we have used, indigenous materials, and I wanted to put emphasis on that, to connect it with abstraction. I spent a lifetime trying to move away from that, simply because, as I said earlier, I'd been colonized mentally in a Western thought about what art making was about. And now that I've understood that, I've spent the last 10 years trying to go backwards and I even went to a point where 30 years ago I wouldn't exhibit with craft work for the simple reason that I had this misconception, and that's part of being brainwashed. I mean, I went to a residential school for 12 years, and I was anglicized, I was Christianized, and I was raised to hate everything about my culture, and that would have included the crafts. And now, of course, you know, students want to handle natural materials, and it requires craftsmanship. And you also get closer to the land. You also get closer to where we come from as a people.
It's kind of interesting to ask that kind of question. In living in Maine, I was fascinated by the basket weavers. Young man, not even quite 35, is an excellent basket weaver, Jeremy Fry. Won a fellowship, $50,000 to do his work. What he did is he created a new movement within the basketry that it functions and shimmers at a level of art. You may not see it. You're like, oh, that's just a basket. But if you know what the basket makers go through and what they do to take that step up and take it up another step, then it becomes art, you know, regardless. You know. And even in that whole process, which is really interesting, is that there is a process to gathering, cutting, allowing that time for the wood to become in line with the maker. Okay? That's an incredible process. There's a thing that Sarah talks about, we don't talk about, you know, it's very hard to be able to be in this kind of a situation and really talk about spirituality, because a lot of us, we're in it. That's how we are. I'm in the country. I love it. I go and talk to a tree. When I actually got to a place where I could begin to really do that, I remember I went to a healing class. I learned that I was a healer. I was living in Davis, California, and I went and I healed a fire hydrant. There were more dogs at that fire hydrant. So I find that rather interesting. In your case, I find it when we're doing our art, we are in communication with spirit, and it's incredible. So with your warrior image, that image came to you. That's your spirit guide. Really say hello to him. Make him yours, because he's there for you. He's there to work you. Thank you.
I really appreciate this discussion because as a person who teaches fiber arts in university and who grew up in a culture which has an incredible craft tradition, but also understanding how modernist contemporary fiber arts function, and then thinking about what I want to say with my arts conceptually as a Native person. I think that the way that we can move between materials and handling things and saying things is really interesting. I think that a lot of people don't understand when they look at clothing, baskets, other things that Native people make, what both Sarah and George just talked about, the spiritual dimension of the object and the way in which you have a relationship. I'm living now teaching in the Pacific Northwest, and the way that the basket makers feel about the cedar tree and the relationship between the basket makers and the cedar tree. At home, the relationship between the basket makers and the sweetgrass and the ash, you know, is a very special kind of thing that that makes the relationship to materials really interesting. And so it's really fun to think about that stuff. And it's also fun to think about how we move culture to speak to the 21st century, the 22nd century, the, you know, posterity, in order to maintain a Native presence. And maintaining a Native presence is a kind of act of sovereignty. In a way, it's not surprising people want to ignore Native art sometimes because they've been suppressing Native culture and trying to do just what happened to Robert in residential school to us for generations and generations. And so the fact that we stand up and say something is, to me, so impressive. And the fact that we can even play with it, you know, and turn it around and be outrageous with it makes me so happy, you know. So that I think that thing about forgetting the art-craft dichotomy is really important. I think Native artists need to make the things that we use in ceremony. They need to make the things for the contemporary gallery. They need to do a million things. And frequently I find myself doing all of those things in different times, in different settings. And that it's fun to be able to move between those kinds of worlds. There are things I make that I would never sell. I would only use in the community. There are things that I make that you know, people in the community like them because they know what I'm talking about. And they get a kick out of it, you know. And I think that it's important to always be pushing the edges, and also pushing the edges inside the community to make people think and frame things in new ways, because I think that's really important. And so this panel has been really fun for me today. Thank you all for your brilliance.
And I wanted to ask, sort of on the tail of that question, since we'll be going up and looking at the art after this discussion, whether any of you have anything you'd sort of like the viewer to keep in mind when they first encounter your work. And I'm thinking about Gail's sort of evocation of audience, because being at the Museum of Art and Design for the first time, well, not for the first time, but for some of these artists for the first time in New York City here instead of NMAI, assuming that this really is a different audience, or hoping that it is a different audience, are there any sort of key words that you'd like to have in the viewer's mind when they go upstairs? Is that a word?
I'm working on a concept now which is real interesting for me to kind of deal with. It has to do with words. I believe words have color. I believe words have power. How you put them together makes my art. So when you go up and look at Buffalo Grass 1, 2, and 3, look at it from that perspective. I use glitter. I always believe Indians like to have glitter. You look at fancy dancers, man, they get out there and they look fantastic. Because they want to be noticed. And I think what's really kind of interesting, as much as there are issues here, there is an important issue that it has to do with, one, not being invisible anymore, and actually acknowledgement and recognition. There is a difference from where Robert and I started out and where this younger group now are. They're in a totally different space. Doesn't mean it's different or better, just it's a different space. You know, if they adhere to their culture, that's their problem. You know, when I see people doing their art, they're doing their art for themselves, and if they decide not to make it known as Indian, that's their prerogative. And I think that's incredible. I mean, I've watched in Maine, I watched these Indians, artists that didn't have a connection, didn't look like to have a connection to cultures, but they were doing something fantastic. But the general public is not looking. So I guess when I come down to it, I ask you, when you go, open your eyes. See with your ears and hear with your eyes. Thank you.
For myself, I would like you to know, and the audience to know, that what's in the show is episode 5, and well, the trailer for episode 6, and episode 6 will be on its way very shortly. So that there are 4, previous episodes that are both on display down at the National Museum of the American Indian, where you can see them in a beautiful room on a beautiful screen, but also you can see them online. So you're just getting a part of the story, and I hope that I think that each episode is a full story on its own, though, that you can enjoy and get a lot out of. And then on another thing I like to I think of as audience is there's like a few levels of audience for the Time Traveler TM works. So one is kind of my native community, and by that that's also kind of multifaceted in a sense, like it's the native artists that I've known for years and that I've been interacting with and who have been helping me develop, and it's the community that I'm from, Kahnawake, near Montreal in Canada. So I think that there are things in there for yous that you're gonna get that other people are not gonna get, you're gonna enjoy that other people might not enjoy. There's people who are into the Second Life and worlds like that, so people who use Second Life, there's little jokes in there for you and things that you're going to enjoy, and then I think that there's, then there's stuff for everyone. There's, I'm hoping that the story works on a number of levels so that it does reach a wider audience.
As a painter, and to the viewer, my wall installation upstairs is based on 24 drawings that were created over a period of a month, and they're based on memory and trauma from the residential school experience after the revelation of who my abusers were. You'll see that. It's very painful, but I like to see them as being beautiful because I survived, and I'm very happy about it. And hence the result, you'll see them in the monitor on the side, but the result is these 6 small, beautiful paintings, I consider. And I try to use colors that were my late mother's favorite colors, and it's a sort of like a family thing as well. And also I wanted to instill the notion that something good came out of trauma. I know that I did not enjoy myself for a whole month, whereby I would start something, and I would finish that drawing, and I would feel it. I would feel the terror and the fear in my body when I was doing it. And the next day, because I said these are going to be based on memory, I would move the bed, or I would move the outhouse, as you will see, and again, relive it again. But then as I would do that, because I wanted to articulate, because, you know, I'd been teaching painting for a long time, and I would always bring the notion of memory, using memory. And I said, well, why don't I actually use it with myself in creating these drawings? In other words, exercise that. But it also was based on going to Ottawa, the national capital in Canada, and our Prime Minister was going to apologize to the residential school experience. The day before I left Toronto to go to Ottawa, I'm in my studio and I'm walking back and forth, and I'm saying to myself, why is there this lingering silent shame? And I said and I began to slowly. I was a little confused because nothing had really, my memory, I had not used the technique. And I went to Ottawa and I saw the Prime Minister in the Parliament apologized, and I was sat next to an 86-year-old Ojibwe warrior and who'd gone to the residential school as well. And then, but it was not until the following year when I went home and I experienced this. And I can sleep with the light on now, and I wanted to celebrate that with that's what these paintings are, and I wanted to reference that. I wanted to give it a place, and that was a classroom.
I think. I guess one of the things that I was thinking about was, you know, a lot of people don't really understand, I think, sometimes how to just look at an artwork, regardless of where it's at, where you encounter it. And, you know, I feel like it's such an opportunity to take the time to really let something unfold. I think everyone who's in this exhibition is incredibly thoughtful about their decisions, their creative decisions of materials and scale and everything. And I think to just walk by and expect the artwork to sort of like hit you with this tremendous impact and that you understand it like this, you're just setting it up for failure immediately. Because what's amazing about artwork is that I think when an artwork actually works, is it does have a voice, and you just have to be quiet enough, patient enough, sit in front of it, remove the distractions, and it's not easy. It's not easy, but it's a free pleasure. You know, so I think that is something that it's taken me a long time to learn, you know, but also when, you know, oftentimes the work that, just in my own history, and I've talked to a lot of artists who have shared this feeling, but, you know, the artwork that oftentimes you find yourself really not responding to initially somehow shifts over 1, 2, 5 years, and you come back and you look at it, and suddenly it's just like a barb, and you can't get it out of your mind, and then all of a sudden you stand in front of it one day, and then that overwhelming feeling hits, and you understand it. But I think, you know, a lot of times people think that, and I teach as well, so, you know, something I work with my students on, but it really is just about turning down the distractions. I mean, tonight's probably really not the best night. If you really want to look at the artwork, you know, come back and choose like 3, you know, in an afternoon to really sit down and to try to engage with. So that would be the one thing, because each one is very unique and unto itself.
Well, I like what you said. I agree with that. And yeah, I think it's I was able to look at the show really briefly, and it is a really impressive group of artists. I think Ellen did a really nice job. And yeah, I guess to kind of continue on what Jeffrey explained is, I think that a lot of the work, for anybody who isn't familiar with contemporary Native art, if there is something that you see that you're interested in, then definitely take the time to look at the body of work in its entirety, because a lot of these group shows are really important, but we don't have the opportunity to fully understand where the artist is coming from because we don't see the full body of work. And I think that you know, as a spectator, as a viewer, yeah, there is a privilege there to be able to go and experience the work, but there's also an opportunity to learn a lot. Most of us have websites, and there's other ways to see more of what the artist wants to share. So.
I don't know really if I have anything else to add to all of that, other than I hope that the artwork will hold its own and you'll be able to just experience it just by looking at it. There's a few costume elements that are sort of with the film and video installation and with the painting. So it's I think it was Ellen's choice to show, I guess, how my performance work has kind of come out of my painting and film work. So I think that's about all I can add to that.
I just wanted to add one thing, just to say that when you see this exhibition, it is very complex, and that all of these artists, and many of the artists in this exhibition, there are 84 artists, so it just tells you what a broad range of individuals comprise this show. It was a long process, a very complicated one, because these artists are extremely accomplished. And so no work was just taken like, well, okay, that's fine. Everything, there was a lot of thought. All of these artists have put a lot of thought into the work that's in the exhibition. And all of them have had amazing careers. So, you know, you can go to natural history and the work is great. But those are all anonymous pieces. All of these pieces are by individuals who are working today. Most of the work is new. We tried to get work specifically for the exhibition or work that's been made in the last 10 years. Most has been made in the last 5 years. And that's important to consider when you look at it. And so I'd say tonight is not the best night to see it. There is a lot of work. A lot of it is very complex. And it is worth coming back and thinking about it a little bit.
I was noticing that the curator of the Whitney Biennial this year announced in the New York Times that it was going to take 6 visits to like grasp all the work there. So I think we should go for what, 7?
A lot of Native cultures have their own mythology, and even though this is a contemporary exhibition, I just wondered if you could speak to us briefly about the mythology and if it infuses your work in any way.
I won't speak about any specific. Well, I won't speak about any specific mythology, but I think it was George who said before, you know, that when we make things, it's really. I know for me, it's been a challenge to believe that this is something that needs to be made, and I'm the person who it's coming to. The thoughts are coming to my mind, through my hands, and making the object. But I think, you know, you started your question by saying contemporary and mythology. There was another word I thought you used, but what I heard was a difference in sort of like time. And I think for for artists, it's I think no matter who you are, you have to believe that you are capable of making something powerful today, tomorrow. So it's not so much a counter of something that existed previously, but it's just a maintenance of something that's been happening throughout history, and your responsibility is to invoke it in the studio.
I believe that inherently that when you handle material, natural material, indigenous material, I think as children when we are raised, we are told there are stories to every natural indigenous material that has been used that you will find in the ethnology museums, in the anthropology museums. We're not actually, as contemporary artists, contemporary indigenous artists, ignoring that. I think we are inherently aware of the mythologies, the stories, the narratives that are attached to the materials that we use. It's far-fetched for me using oils, but but I do understand that, and I have handled natural material before, about 20 years ago, when I used skulls, not human skulls, but cow skulls and buffalo skull, and you begin to have some kind of a communion, or you begin to have some connection in the stories that come with that. And also, like even in teaching, even if they're non-native students, I encourage them, if you're going to take something to, like for example, I'm sure Bonnie did that, and I don't want to speak to her about it, but when you like for cedar, I mean, you offer tobacco, and simply the reason for that act is that it's based on mythology. It's based on giving thanks and thanking the Creator, and thanking the tree, thanking the grass that is being braided, thanking and I encourage my students that even to shove tobacco on the bark of the tree if they're going to be using wood or harvesting natural materials, because it comes from the land. We have to say miigwech to the plant or to the tree.
I'm Iroquois. Thank God for that. To all the Iroquois. All right. But my main interest has been, I believe this. I at one time I had a past life where I was in the Plains area. I was a warrior. So the mythology of it is I did war shirts. And I thought about the war shirts. War shirts were created basically for power and protection. And what I did with that is I put that all into the painting. You know, I actually had thought at one time I did a Ralph Lauren war shirt, and I actually took buttons off one of his shirt and I plastered them on my collage. And that was my connection to the mythologies and so forth. But it's interesting. I did the one large painting that I, quote, consider my masterpiece, just by mere time and length, 25 feet. On one level, there was a drawing that I had to do of a Pawnee man in a circle, and I started to draw it, and I just couldn't get it, you know. And then didn't think I had the ability to kind of do it. And I kept asking myself, what's the problem here? Why can't I? You know, I'm an artist. Why can't I do that? And the voice came back and said, "Why don't you speak to him?" That's pretty heavy stuff. Speak to him. But I took that with a lot of uncertainty, and so I sat down and I burnt cedar and I burnt grass, and I just covered my whole painting with white sage. And I said to him, I said, why won't you let me paint them? He said, well, they stole my soul because they took my picture. I said, well, what I want to do is I want to give back your soul to you so that you can take your next step. He thought about it for a while. I said, okay, let's do it. That drawing was done in 3 days. It's a large drawing. It's almost life-size. It was incredible. But what I have for myself, what I call, is what we don't talk about, my spiritual space. My spiritual space is, there's my canvas. My spiritual space is where I stand looking at my canvas, and as I walk towards it, I'm going through my spiritual space. I'm resolving my problems. So when I touch that canvas, I have certainty. And come back, and I go through it again. That painting, which is my masterpiece, took me a year and a month, but when it was done, it was done. It was complete. It was wet, it was complete.
I already asked Jeffrey if he has an avatar, so I'm going to ask Kent, do you hear voices? And in some seriousness, like you're often engaging with the past because you feel that things have been suppressed and left out of official narratives, especially alternative, well, I shouldn't say alternative, traditional sexualities and gender expressions. So do you feel in a way you're speaking for?
Well, I certainly don't couch it in those terms, but I don't couch it in those terms, but I feel as though I have a pretty vivid imagination. So I have learned to trust my own instincts in terms of just my gut instincts about how I create the imagery and how it kind of, more or less flows freely. So I stopped sort of second guessing that quite a while ago. And so when I do create and when I do sort of engage with the actual material, and I think this is kind of coming back to the contact with the medium, is that you never really know. That's the beauty of actually making the work yourself with your own hands, as a painter and in any other medium, is that you don't really know what it's going to end up being until you go through that process of creating it. And I think that there's a kind of alchemy that happens in that process, and you sometimes make the wrong decisions, and sometimes you don't really know where you're going to end up. But I think there's a kind of just a trusting of instinct that happens. And I think that that's part of your growth and maturity as an artist, is that you stop second guessing that and you just kind of allow it to move. And then when things don't work out, that you just redo them or you find a way of making it work. But that's the way that I work. And a lot of it is instinct, and it comes from, I think, a rigorous process of doing research. But there's also that sort of ambiguous area where it is the unknown. And I think that's the thing about all of these artists that are in the show, is like this ability to transcend that fear of going to the unknown and to kind of deal with that space of not knowing what you're doing sometimes.
We have time, I think, for one last question.
Well, to conclude this, I was curious to know how you would identify yourselves. Would you say, if someone asked you, are you an artist, would you respond, I'm an artist, or would you say, I'm a native artist?
Pass.
You get it? I've got two.
It's hogging them.
Get this over with, huh?
I think that you know, when we live in a world where everything's kind of named and defined and it's all loaded terms, I think you use them strategically. I think, and it's really about being an effective communicator. Sometimes I know when I say that, I'm always saying it for effect, or I'm not saying it for effect. And I think that that's, it's about a broader vision, that it's like whatever is going to contextualize the work in the best way, you know. But I certainly am not afraid of being called either. You know, I think it's, I mean, for all of the challenges that Native people and have had, and not just to isolate Native people, but, you know, challenges really do make you stronger. And they make you think twice, 3 times, 4 times, you know. You come up with a million different ways to use the same thing. So I think that's, I think it's just, it's trying to be incredibly present, you know, in any situation when you're speaking or when you're introducing yourself, and just thinking about what's going to be the best situation you can create. And I think those words are incredibly loaded and therefore can be strategic.
It's also the level where it can also pigeonhole you. Oh, he's an Indian artist, second-class citizen. I find that rather interesting because that's how they look at it. And I'm not blue chip. I'm not in the main wonderful galleries in New York City. So, you know, I for myself, I've gone through a tremendous healing on myself to be able to kind of be in this kind of a situation and talk about it. Someone asks me, I don't really deal with that in any way. Look at me, I'm a spirit. Thank you. If you want to understand my biology, yes, I was born into an Indian family, but I'm a spirit. And I create as a spirit. It took a lot of long healing to be able to kind of really be in that space to say that. And, you know, that's an incredible place to be.
I think answering that question either way would probably bring us back to 40 years ago, so I won't answer it.
Okay. So I guess